Well, hello, and welcome back. It's good to be with each one of you. The time is now 9:29 on the 14th. So, if you have not submitted your assignment, it is due today. And while I'm here, I am going to check just to see if there are any submissions who has submitted. I just want to remind you that um, as you are going through and doing your work, to make sure that make sure that you're getting your stuff in, because by all means, you don't want to end up on the wrong side of the grade, the grades that you want to receive for this course. So make sure that you are getting getting your stuff in. Make sure that you're getting your stuff in. And clearly, this is not. Well, I'll talk about that later. But anyway, and that's why you don't do that stuff on screen. But anyway, I did want to just bring a short lecture. Hopefully, it will be helpful to you in your reading and your watching. What I wanted to talk about, as you know, this is a class about race. Film and Society is the title of the course. So today, I want to talk about negotiating spaces, the acceptance of race as a part of identity. And you read last week Michael Gomez's book, Our Country Marks, or at least a portion of it, just a chapter, but you did read a portion of it, and so I did want to at least highlight it because it's a landmark text, right? It's a seminal text, right, in terms of race studies. This is one that you definitely want to read. You definitely want to have under your belt if this is something that you want to look at a deeper level. And so the basic point of this book is to demonstrate the ways in which Africans in America, early Africans in America, negotiated the color line. Gomez posits that Africans did not necessarily understand themselves to be black initially, that it was an identity that was given to them, but one that they had to negotiate for themselves, ultimately making the decision to become black, right? Black, and whatever that means. Now, this is different for those of us who have always thought of ourselves as black or white or some other kind of racial category. But for the earliest settlers of America, they did not think of themselves in these ways. The idea of race is a relatively new phenomenon in the human enterprise, one that only began to come into being in the 17th and then into the 18th century. The negotiation of race happened on both sides of the coin, as whites had to make an initial decision to define themselves as white as opposed to the various ethnicities and nations from which they came. And there's strong evidence that early in the settlement of Virginia and the other colonies that Englishmen were called just that. It's not until we get to late in the 17th century, which are the 1600s, and into the 18th century, which would be the 1700s, in official documents, that there is a shift, that those who are once called white, or those who are once called English, are being called white. This move incorporated a larger population of Europeans who may have looked similar, but ultimately came from disparate backgrounds. That is to say, whiteness is becoming a cultural marker of distinction as opposed to English, French, Dutch, German, such and so forth. In this line of thinking, white, hear me now, white is what becomes important, as opposed to ethnicity, culture, language, dress, or even class. A new culture is forming, one that is race-based. Okay. So one of the other things that we looked at last week and got an opportunity to talk about it a little bit was Lerone Bennett's chapter titled The Road Not Taken. And it's a part of a book titled The Shaping of Black America. And I definitely encourage you to take a look at the text if you're able, not just the chapter that was posted in Canvas, but the entire text. It's a wonderful book, an interesting thesis. But I mentioned Bennett to talk about his approach to white negotiation of race, that in his estimation, it was not an easy or pure transition for many Europeans, specifically English people, to think of themselves as white, particularly of those of lower working classes who would have had more contact with Negro servants and then slaves, right? Africans would have worked alongside of, worked with, held relationships, romantic and otherwise, and also purely sexual relationships with those who would consider themselves to be white. And so whiteness and what it entails and what it entailed, right, at that point in time was not an easy transition even for some whites. Why? They had more in common with the folk that they saw every day, that they worked alongside with every day, than those whom they looked like. Okay, it is not until it was understood to be advantageous to be white that the transition begins to occur. Advantageous either through coercion or through true advantage of a higher social status, employability, but most of all, freedom, right? That black becomes synonymous with slave, okay? I say all that to return to Gomez and the negotiation that took place on the part of blacks. His text only goes up until 1830, which gives a perfect launching pad to talk about the formation and construction of race as identity marker. All right, so let's take a break. Let's break out for just a second. And let's ask this question. Why are identity markers important? You probably have an answer for yourself on this question in mind, but as far as I'm concerned, what makes identity markers important is that they help to tell the story of one's life in a short summary. In other words, to say that one is black or white or rich or poor, educated or uneducated, gives meaning in a way that signifies a set of cultural assumptions, right? Basically, right, let's think about it along these lines, right? And maybe some of these are stereotypes, others maybe not so much, right? So let's say in talking to you, you discovered that I was a plumber, okay? I didn't say that I owned a plumbing business, but that I was a plumber. Now, there's certain, right, things that you would assume about me, right? One is, okay, he's probably pretty good with his hands. Number two, he probably makes really good money. Number three, right, may be trained, but not necessarily educated, right? Now, all of these may or may not be true, but based on just simply saying that one is a plumber, there are certain things that come along with that. In the same way, right, in the same way that what one does for a living helps to identify who that person is, so in the same way are other identity markers, such as race. So, for instance, one may assume, right, that as a black male born in the 1980s, that I may like fried chicken, fried foods, and that because I'm a part of at the beginnings of the millennial generation, that I also like hip hop rap music, right? Now, once again, may or may not be true. I could be a vegan and I may be a Nirvana fan, all right? But more often than not, is going to hit it right on the head. That's part of the danger of stereotypes, is that there is some smidgen of truth that is embedded within stereotypes, right? And this is really what race does for us. By setting up classifications of people, we're able to determine what and who those people are, what they are capable of, what they are not capable of, where they are going, and what they are doing. In other words, it is through our categories that we're able to make assumptions, okay? Beyond the assumptions that outsiders make based upon these various identity markers that make up an individual, our identity markers in very real ways help to form personal consciousness. In other words, they help to inform the way we think about ourselves, right? So there are certain things, because I am a male who identifies as a man, a black man, there are certain things that I will and will not do because of the personal consciousness that has formed inside of me. But my personal consciousness is never divorced from a larger cultural strata that sits behind me at all times. Okay. This is not to say that one has to be constrained by identity markers, but in large measure, identity markers do help us to formulate the way we think about ourselves, and then also the way we think about the world that is around us, and then how we interact with that world, right? So Gomez, to return to Gomez, Gomez's argument is that Africans early on did not see color in race, but only in description. In other words, they did not see color as an identity marker. So a black man or a black woman early on is irrelevant. What is important, however, is who are your people? This is why, one of the things that blacks in America and in the U.S., should I say, I don't know about in the Caribbean as well as in South America and other parts of North America, namely Mexico, where there were a fair number of slaves that went there as well. I personally do not know the ways in which they end up not taking up race, but the ways in which what's the word that I'm searching for? How they think about, kind of their enslavement. But I know for black U.S. citizens, often one of the questions that ends up coming about is, how could other black folk, sell other black folk into slavery? Because they didn't think about them as black. I know it's mind-boggling for us because we have no other real way of thinking about ourselves other than being black and being African American, and that forming in and of itself kind of its own kind of racial / ethnic category. But they didn't think about it that way. Yeah, you black. Yeah, you look like me. But you don't speak my language. You don't worship my God. You are not my people. It's the same way that you end up, right, with the world wars in Europe in the 1900s in the 20th century, right? Because they didn't necessarily think about themselves as, oh, we all white people. No, we German and we Austrian, and we want to take over the rest of these folk. They're inferior to us, right? And so part of our struggle in terms of this is that we have a racial identity, whereas for many of these folks, they don't really have a racial identity. And this also holds true in large measure when you have black people who come from the diaspora all around the world to these United States, and we meet them and we consider them to be black upon sight. Then they open their mouths and say, okay, you're not from here. And they don't, and at times they will say, hey, I'm not black. And what they're saying is not that they're white or something else, but what they're saying is they don't have the same personal consciousness or communal consciousness. They don't have the same cultural memories that inform their personal consciousness that go into what it means to be black, right? In an American sense, to be black, but they're a different kind of black, right? And we've seen this to be true, right? In particular, at American Baptist College, we've got a fair number of Bahamian students. When they first get here, they don't necessarily think about themselves as black. Now, the longer they're here, they start to figure it out. Okay, but even though there are some differences, everybody else gonna treat us like we're together. So we need to, okay. And this is this is what Gomez's argument is, that a part of his argument is that it took some time, but once they began to figure out that in this particular consciousness, a racial consciousness would serve them better than an ethnic consciousness, then things begin to move along in terms of the formation of racial identity. Okay. So in the same way, right, that there were various, and there still are various kinds of Europeans and various kinds of Africans, right? So many cultures, languages, religious expressions from which, right, these unlucky Africans were taken. They were different peoples. Bantu are not Mandinka. Mande are not Bambara, and Yoruba are not from the Senegambia groups. These people understood themselves to be distinct in very significant ways outside of their skin color or any other physical attributes. Right? Now, we don't have the time to go through Gomez's entire argument, but I want you to understand the overall themes and thesis. The overall themes and thesis. Gomez's argument is one of negotiation, but also of acculturation. Acculturation, how does culture transfer into and onto new groups? Where and how does it change? How do they adapt it to their needs and their desires? This is the question of race concerning early Africans in America. It was not until generations had passed and it became advantageous for African people to cease to think of themselves primarily in ethnic terms that they began to switch to race. It was only through the gradual acculturation process that they understood black to mean something specific, even if it was not completely definable. And I think that's one of the beauties of black, right, of blackness. And that's part of then what we get at in this class as we talk about these various films. Yeah, there is something specific about being black, but it's not completely definable, right? In other words, you can't take us and put us in a box and say, this is black, this is not black. But when we see it, we know it. When we recognize it, we know that which it is, and we also know when it is being perpetrated against us, right? And so in your work, in your writings, in the papers, your tech-savvy reflections, that's what you're getting at. That piece that is specific but not definable, okay? So in the chapter that hopefully you have read, Gomez describes this to some degree, but it's an introductory chapter, so he is really just trying to lay the framework for that which is going to follow. At this point, however, his basic point is that Denmark Vesey's attempted uprising was able to be thwarted because the blacks in South Carolina had a split consciousness. They didn't understand themselves to be black, but rather thought of themselves in various ethnic units, right? Therefore, each one not necessarily being loyal to the other. It was this split consciousness that allowed their forces to be infiltrated and ultimately destroyed. I'm going to take a time out. I know I want to go through and talk about Denmark Vesey for just a second, but to give you maybe a more relatable example, I want you to think about this scene from Roots. Hopefully, each one of you has seen the miniseries Roots and or read the book by Alex Haley. But there's one very, very memorable scenes out of many in the miniseries, but where Kunta has just been taken from the coast and has been placed on the slave ship. And while they are in the belly of the ship, they all get together, those who are in the process of being enslaved, being transported to a foreign land from their homes, their families, and their peoples, where they all get together and decide, hey, if we're going to make it through this thing, we're going to have to make through it together. And so they begin to learn, right, in the belly of the ship, they begin to learn one another's languages. Why? So that they can communicate with each other, so that when the time comes, they can overtake the ship and they can sail back home. Now, their attempt to overtake the ship falls flat, not because there was a snitch involved, but because ultimately they were overpowered. Those who were in charge of the ship had guns, they had cannons, they had superior forces, and these are people who are attempting to break out of chains and fight at the same time. But what my point is here is this, that you see even there in the belly of this ship, the beginning of the formation of group consciousness, right? And that's always the first step in terms of forming a new entity that is its own thing. Okay, you see the beginnings. They'd see, okay, even though we not all the same, and we know we not all the same, they're treating us like we're all the same, and we're all going to have the same destiny if we don't all come together on the same page to get to what we really want. Okay, and so this happens to some degree in South Carolina, but not in the same way, right? Denmark Vesey in 1822 attempts to revolt. He's a free man himself, but he's attempting to get together all the slaves in the area and in Charleston, and are unable to do so. They had weapons, they had people, they had a planned revolt, but it never got off the ground. According to Gomez, this was due, at least in part, to the fragmented consciousness that blacks had in the area. With competing loyalties, it was easy for slaveholders to interrupt what would have easily been one of the largest slave revolts in history, certainly American history. This is contrasted to what occurred in Haiti a few years earlier, in which the Haitians were successful in overthrowing their enslavers. This was in part because of the cultural, linguistic, and religious cohesion among blacks in Haiti. One of the things that was done in North America specifically is, one, plantations tended not to be as large as they were in Haiti, but particularly all throughout the Caribbean, right? One of the things that happened in the Caribbean is that you had absent overlords. And so masters often would not even reside on the islands. And the same thing also in South America and Brazil in particular, did not reside on the plantations. What does that mean? And they participated in large gang labor. So what does this mean? This means that even though these were different people that were brought here in terms of the Africans, they had enough in common from a language standpoint, but also from a cultural, religious standpoint, that they were able to form new languages, new cultures, and new religions that resembled that which they had known in their homelands, right? This is contrasted to North America, where there was a conscious effort to not put those who were being enslaved and from the same areas in Africa on the same plantations, and even in the same areas in North America. Why was this? They didn't want them to communicate. They wanted them, at least initially in particular, in those first few generations, to have to communicate through a medium, right? And or through another language of which they could understand, right? And so speaking in African tongues was outlawed, as well as banging on drums. These kinds of things that would have allowed them to preserve their own kind of cultural consciousness doesn't happen, right? And so by the time you get to now, what, the 19th century, imagine this racial consciousness. I want you to bear in mind, racial consciousness, right, has been forming since the 16th century, so nearly 200 years, okay, has been forming. But one of the things that is also particular about South Carolina, Charleston, is that there were always consistently, until the slave trade was truly abolished, they were consistently and always importing new slaves. So what does that mean? These are people who are not thinking of themselves in racial categories. They're thinking of themselves in ethnic categories. Why? Well, because that's what they know. That's what they're used to. They don't know anything about the way things are done over here. Okay? And so Gomez's argument is that this is what helps to break down this plot. Okay? That because they did not have the same cohesion in terms of their culture, their language, and their religion in the same kinds of ways that occurred in Haiti, they were disempowered, right, in terms of their plotting and their planning and their ability to think in silence and secrecy until the moment had arrived. Vesey's plot was ultimately upended because someone snitched. Talk about the original Stop Snitching campaign. Okay, and this is where Gomez's books begins. It begins with this plot, an appropriate place to begin, close to the ending. He only traces up to 1830. In Gomez's estimation, the negotiation of African peoples becoming black was a gradual process that was due in part to cultural contact with Euro-Americans who converted to whiteness, and continuous contact between African cultural heritage that over time began to blend. Given that different groups were concentrated differently in various areas of the South and all throughout what became the United States, what black looks like, quite honestly, although there are great similarities, we know that there's differences, right? There are differences, right, between northern blacks and southern blacks, right? Those who are out on the West Coast and those who are in the Midwest, those who are in Texas and those who are in Florida. There are some real differences. However, right, the race, there's this overlying piece of race. The race of black, or the cultural acceptance, it occurred over time. Blackness, in other words, was created, mostly to show the difference between that itself and white or whiteness, but also to be synonymous with slave. And the question that we have to answer is, how did blacks negotiate their own blackness? Was it the same as the perception and thoughts of whites? Or were there major differences? So as we get ready to end, I want to ask a couple of questions. All right. In terms of, we're talking about the formation of racial consciousness, racial identity for a whole group of people. Right. So my question is, how do you imagine people from various ethnicities to comprehend that they are now black? In other words, right, what is an immigrant from, let's say, Ethiopia, right? All their life, they have been Ethiopian. They haven't been black. So how do they now process coming into these United States of America, in the world in which we live, where George Floyd is, shot down, or rather George Floyd is choked out, not shot down, excuse me, on the streets, and Breonna Taylor is shot down in her bed while sleeping, right? And so we see black people rising up and fighting on behalf of other black folks. What is someone, we said it, Ethiopian, how does the Ethiopian now come into a space like this? How do they begin to understand that, yeah, I'm Ethiopian, and that's a part of me that will never go away, that will always be ultimately who I am. But now in this space, amongst these people, I'm black. Okay? And then also another question I want to ask is, what factors, if any, would you think could entice a group of people to embrace race as a central category of their identity? Right? So why would an entire group of people decide, okay, we're no longer going to be XYZ, whatever it was that we were before, we are now this. All right? What would make a people do this? Just to give you an example, as you guys know, American Baptist colleges, essentially in some respects, it's a liberal arts college, but it's also a Bible college. So I don't feel strange about throwing out this example. If you go and you look in the book of Exodus, as the people of Israel are coming out of Egypt, the text says that they were a mixed multitude. Now, one may wonder what that means. Probably we all wonder exactly what does the text mean when it calls them a mixed multitude. I would submit that it probably means that within the original composition of what becomes Israel, you have people from various ethnicities. What is it then that makes these people, who are a mixed multitude, come under the banner of Israel and declare themselves to be Israelites, followers of Moses, and worshipers of Yahweh? Right. So that's another kind of just an example to give you maybe some insight in thinking through, okay, what factors, if any, do you think could entice a group of people to embrace race as a central category of identity? All right. So that's it. I'm going to send out an email to you all, hopefully on tonight. I'm so excited about this. I have been in conversation. Professor William Green has been so gracious to all of us, and thankful to him for the work that he's doing with the chapel and through his various positions at the school. But in one of those, he reached out to me, and he knows a lady by the name of Dr. Hazel Joyner Smith. Dr. Hazel Joyner Smith. You may have heard of her, you may not, but you want to hear her if you have not heard of her. She is the founder of the International Black Film Festival. She started it about 15 years ago, and it is housed right here in Nashville. And in and through conversation with Dr. Joyner Smith, she has agreed to come and to join our class on at least one night in through this course here. And so the date that she and I had talked about was July the 23rd, which, if I'm not mistaken, is next Thursday. And that would then allow us to do a live class on Zoom next Thursday at 6 p.m. So I'm going to send out an email. Please make sure that you respond, because I don't want to schedule the class if, there's a lot of people who have to work, or, I don't know, Bible study, whatever it is that y'all, the commitments that you have and that you cannot get out of. So I do want to bear in mind, that there are other roles and responsibilities that we all bear. And in particular, during this time and period of lockdowns and quarantines and staying in the home, it's not as easy to negotiate maybe in times when times are normal, right? We don't have access, or we don't want access to babysitters and other kinds of folk, because we don't know where they've gone, who they come into contact with, what they have done with their bodies. Are they going to these so-called corona parties and the like? And are they going to put our children and then us in danger to contract this dreaded disease? And so, I do realize that. So I do want to make sure that we are keeping those kinds of things in mind. And if that's not a time that works, for us to find a time that will work a little bit better for all of us. Okay. And with that also in mind, when she joins us, please, 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 please. And also, even when I go live, please be engaged, do your reading, come with questions, because I believe that it's going to be so fire just from the conversation that I've had with her thus far. I know that she has much to say, and of the much that she has to say, there's much that you want to hear. So in any case, I'm signing off for now. We'll talk with you later. Make sure that you're getting in Canvas, getting your work, and I will talk and see you all later. Bye-bye.